On This Week in Enterprise Tech, it's a special end-of-the-year episode. That's right, we've taken some of our favorite moments from 2017 and put them all in one place. Folks, it's the best of 2017. TWiET on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiET.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is TWiET. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 271 for Friday, December 29th, 2017. The best of 2017. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by GoToWebinar, a trusted webinar platform with over 55,000 customers who have hosted over 2.7 million interactive web events to connect with their audiences. For more, visit gotowebinar.com/podcast. Welcome to TWiET This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. And today I'm actually guiding you by myself because this is not a regular episode. This is an end-of-the-year episode, a best-of episode. This is our chance to gather together some of our favorite interviews, our favorite segments, and we'll give them back to you, our loyal audience. So without further ado, this is our favorites of 2017. Trump has named existing FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai to the chair of the FCC. Now, this is made possible because he was already a chairman. I'm not a chairman. He was already on the commission, which means he doesn't need Senate approval. He doesn't need to come in and go through the nomination process again. It does mean that if he wants to continue past the current term, which Wheeler vacated, he will have to go through that approval. But let's set all that aside. Let's set aside the politics. Let's set aside who approved him. Let's set aside what he has said, and let's take a look at the man himself. Here's what we know about Ajit Pai. We know that he's age 44, born in 1973 in Buffalo, New York. He's the son of immigrants from India. He earned a BA from Harvard in '94, where he was a debater. He got his JD from the University of Chicago in 1997, and he started his career as a clerk in the U.S. District Court for Eastern Louisiana. He moved to D.C. in '98, and he worked at the U.S. Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, where he worked on mergers and acquisitions. Specifically, he examined and gave recommendations for companies that were asking for regulatory relief, exemptions, after the Telecommunications Act of 1996. After leaving the DOJ in 2001, he became the Associate General Counsel at Verizon Communications. 2 years later, in 2003, he was hired to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Administrative Oversight. He returned to the DOJ in 2004 as Senior Counsel in the Office of Legal Policy and became Chief Counsel to the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Property Rights. From 2007 to 2011, he worked in the FCC's Office of General Counsel, and then in 2011, he was nominated by President Barack Obama for the FCC Commission. His term concluded on June 30th, 2016, and now he is the chairman. So that's who he is. That's his history. Let's take a look at what his policies might be. There's been a lot of screaming. There's been a lot of fear that this means the death of net neutrality because as a commissioner, he was very vocal, very adamant in his opposition to any sort of regulatory solution to net neutrality. Lou, let me start with you. This is one of these things where I think we need to take a step back because I know at least I was very wrong in the last commissioner. I thought Wheeler was going to be a rubber stamp cable and the network toady, and he turned out to be someone who actually fought for the same things that I thought should be fought for. What should we take from this? I mean, obviously he's got chops. He's been doing this for a while. He's been involved in this specific type of law. He's been both in government and in industry and back to government. What do you expect is going to happen in the first, say, 6 months to a year of this new chairman?
You know, I really hope that he takes an objective view of all this. I mean, like you said, he was a counsel on Verizon Communications. So I think, could it mean that he's partial to the communication companies? We don't know. I mean, I think maybe because he left and he did other things years after that. It's been almost 15 years ago that he did that. So question is, what what are his views now? And I think we've kind of seen a little bit of that coming forward from some of the things that are written about him and some of the interviews that he's done in the past. And I'm hoping that what's going to happen is that we'll be surprised. And that, just maybe there'll be some alternate methods of taking what we have today, some of the policies we have today, and just altering them in a way that maybe it's even a better approach. But, again, based off his historical data, you went through the man, and it could go either way. I mean, there's to me, you have to have a crystal ball at this point to be able to tell what he's going to do and how he's going to be influenced. Could be influenced by the current, the current office, right? So I think there's something that to be said with just wait in time, and also make sure your voice is heard at this point.
I think that's really the best advice for that, because again, I will admit I got caught on the last guy. I really thought that Wheeler was going to be horrible, and he turned out to be quite good. But I'm going to throw this over to you, Curtis. A few years back, I think it was in 2014, he gave a speech at Carnegie Mellon, and in that speech, he offered 3 principles, and this was specifically as he was starting to debate net neutrality. He thought that there were 3 things that the FCC absolutely needed to do in order to encourage investment in the broadband network of this country. The first thing was that the FCC should be as nimble as the industry in which it oversees. And to that effect, he proposed that there's a 1-year deadline to consider any new technology that comes due. And this was to get, to remove what we had come to expect from the FCC, which is sits around on its hands all day, and it's regulating the landline telephone when cell phones had become normal. And to that extent, I like that. I like a commissioner who says, no, we can't wait 6 months. This technology will be gone in 6 months. We need to take a look at it now. The second thing was that he wants to encourage investment by removing regulatory barriers to that investment. Now, this is the one that people are kind of freaking out about, because they assume that means he's going to be against all regulation, but that's not what he said. What he said is he wants to look at the regulation that specifically inhibits investment. That is, it's a fine line, but it's a fine line that's very, very important. The third thing, and again, I agree with him on this, was that the FCC should allocate more spectrum to mobile communications. So, Curtis, in these 3 things, 2 of them, I think even the most liberal of the TWiET riot will agree are good. We do want the FCC to be nimble, and we do want the FCC to make sure that more spectrum is allocated to wireless companies. But what is it about that second point? What is it about the regulation that has so many people afraid?
Well, the industry has long told us that any regulation, anything that tends to restrict the way they want to operate, discourages them from making investments in new infrastructure. So if you do anything that places a restriction on how they can operate, then they are less likely to do things like build out new cable plants and invest in new routing and switching frameworks. Now, historically, we've seen that is a limited case because we have had reasonable investment. But there is a philosophy that says that what would best benefit the American communications consumer, and here let's say we know that on a global scale we have pretty poor bandwidth here in the U.S. as a whole, that we would benefit from more competition and the ability for telecoms to be able to make an investment knowing that they can recoup that investment through business practices that let them, let's be honest, charge whatever the market will bear. So I think what we're going to see is some sort of balancing act where over the past 4 to 8 years, the balance has swung a bit in the direction of actively protecting consumers with the assumption that large corporations need to be restricted in what they can do, to one that tends to free up those companies with the idea that they will then use that freedom to invest more heavily, compete more effectively, and the results of that competition will be of greater benefit to the consumer. We won't know whether that's true for another 4 to 8 years, but it's certainly going to be interesting to watch in the meantime.
Right. And okay, Lou, let me throw this over to you, because There's been something that's been going around, a little mantra in my head since it became pretty obvious that Pi was going to get this position, and that is, when you look at what Wheeler's legacy is, and that's net neutrality is a big part of it, although it's not the only part of that. Wheeler fought for a lot of other things other than just net neutrality. One of the things that Wheeler said that has always stayed with me was he wanted the reclassification because he wanted the FCC to be able to have a stick to force the industry to do what was in the best interest of the people. He didn't necessarily want to use that stick. In fact, several times he said, I would prefer that we not have to use the reclassification. However, the ISPs have made that impractical because since we have no power over them, they're basically running everything the way that they want, even though it's obvious that it's counter to the best good of the country. It sounds to me that Pi actually, he's closer to Wheeler than he's closer to the people who are saying pure competition, remove all regulations, let everything shake out as it may. I mean, in 2012, he was one of the leading voices on the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee. He was warning them against regulatory uncertainty. In other words, he wants companies to know exactly what the regulations are, and he wants to know when the hammer comes down. It sounds from his history as if he's the kind of man who says, look, I want to let the companies, I want to let these corporations battle it out because when they battle it out, that's good for the consumers. But at the same time, I'd like something in my back pocket so that if they start colluding, I can smack that up because he's had a history of that as well. What's your take?
I think he's following the theory on how you take care of your kids, because that's really what you want to do.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
They run wild, right, until you want to take that big stick now. But no, essentially, I think that it makes sense. I think that he's following the roots of the party, right, to have smaller government involvement in things. But what he does want is he doesn't want the kids to run wild in the sense that they're going to cause all kind of mayhem and consumer issues around costing and pricing and you know, even and hinder competition. I think at this point, like, I think you're right. I think competition is important, and the only way you're going to ensure competition and is ensure there's a fair playing field, especially for the smaller guy, you know, and these up and comings. And I think that that's what we hope. I think from what he's saying is he's going to let them try to beat each other out in any way that they can, kind of like how the telecom communication companies are doing today in pricings and features and unlimited this and unlimited that. But, you know, in the same sense, I want some regulation in my pocket so I can pull it out and say, okay, it's gone too much, gone too far. Let's take a step back and let's start regulating. And I think that's the way. I think to me that might even be more effective than what it is today.
Right. And okay, just so that people don't think that I'm all pro Pi. He also had a stint during his career at the DOJ, and again, this was right after the passage of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, where he was basically the one who was allowing companies, well, not allowing, but recommending that companies be allowed to merge, even though we had broken up the telecommunications monopoly. So, yes, you could look at that and you can be afraid. I prefer to look at his whole record and say, okay, there's a little bit of promise here. Let's move, same topic, but slightly evolved. Again, net neutrality isn't the only thing that the FCC has worked on. One of the landmark cases that the FCC has worked on was the opening up of utility poles, the so-called attachment. In other words, what does it take for, say, a newcomer to use the same poles that incumbents were using? Well, because there had been no federal regulation in the past, localities were allowed to make regulations, and that meant that if, say, Sonic wanted to come into San Francisco, they might have to negotiate 50 different times to get on 50 different poles. That's not how it was under FCC's Wheeler. And FCC's Wheeler is like, no, there's one policy. Absolutely, you will be able to get on the pole, and we will be your advocate in doing that because we believe that spurs competition. Even though the Ars Technica article that we brought up says that Pi is willing to take a weed whacker to net neutrality regulations, it says nothing at all about some of the other legislation, the other rules, policies that Wheeler's FCC worked on, especially the attachment rate. So, Curtis, do you think if net neutrality were to go away, let's say everything that they did about net neutrality went away, and it won't, we're going to talk about that in a bit, but if it did, would there still be enough to work with that attachment? If the FCC stood behind that policy, stood behind that ruling and said, no, if you're a new ISP and you want to compete, we will make sure that you have the means to compete, does that still get a little bit of the goal of net neutrality, even though we don't call it net neutrality?
Well, if the goal of net neutrality is to have lots of choices and through lots of choices have lower cost for consumers, then the attachment rate really does offer some promise. And I think what we're going to really have to look at is which side of the political philosophy rules in this case, because this is one where you can look at it a couple of ways. From the political conservative standpoint, on the one hand, there is the push towards federalism, and that would say that local governments tend to be able to make the best regulations for the people within that government. You know, essentially that governance happens best when it's closest to the people. The other side says that in a capitalist economic system, that competition is good. And so things that spur competition, that don't inhibit competition, tend to be better. Again, you can make a political philosophy argument in either direction. We don't know yet which of those is going to hold sway. And I think that's a big piece of the concern here. Because on the one hand, we could see things balance out in a way that leaves consumers in a pretty good position. On the other hand, we could see things balance out in a way that leaves consumers paying more money for poorer performance. We won't know the results until we see the regulations, and that's going to take a little while to come down the pike.
Right, and let's remember, even though he's going to quote unquote take a weed whacker to the regulations, that doesn't mean that he doesn't want some sort of regulations. He was opposed to this iteration of the net neutrality regulation. So as JJ to the 4884 in the chat room has asked, will we have fast lanes? Probably, because the first plan that Wheeler put out was actually backed by the Republican part of the FCC. So we're probably going to see that again. Lou, last question. I want to throw this over to you really quickly. Okay, so in looking at this, again, there's this desire to panic. There's this desire to say that the sky is falling. However, there is one super silver lining even for the most progressive / liberal of our audience members, and that is the hardest part of the net neutrality policy was to get the right to reclassify the ISPs. That's the one that went back and forth in the courts. If you remember, that ran the entire Obama administration. Now that they have that precedent, you cannot remove the precedent. Which means that if suddenly, let's say Pi were to decide to unclassify the ISPs under Title II, if there was another administration change, the new person could just reclassify and there's no legal fight because the precedent still exists. That's the weird part about this, right? I mean, the hard part's over and you can't get rid of it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of it, right? Because now you're saying that, you know, it's already been passed through and it's already been approved and it seems to make sense. And so I think that at this point, people are going to wonder if this is attempted by the administration to kind of take it back, so to speak. You know, what is their agenda then there? I think at that point, and so I think it's going to be interesting to see how this moves forward, because I think, you know, what we're saying is, you know, we already have the precedents there. We already have the reclassification. We already know that common carriers are going to be considered this. And how is that going to play out? I think how are we going to handle this going forward? And I think hopefully we'll see an unbiased way of doing it.
New York is suing Charter and Time Warner Cable for false promises of fast internet. This past Wednesday, Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General of New York, filed a lawsuit against Charter and Time Warner Cable, which is a subsidiary of Charter. The basis of the suit is that the two ISPs led a, quote, deliberate scheme to defraud and mislead New Yorkers by promising internet services that they could not deliver, unquote. The suit continues to allege that subscribers of premium plans, which promise to deliver 100, 200, and 300 megabits per second and cost as much as $109.99 per month, were getting speeds that were typically 70% slower than their rated speed. It also claims that those much slower speeds were delivered inconsistently as the network was not reliable, often inexplicably timing out to servers that had little to no load. The New York AG is claiming that the lack of capital investment by Time Warner is a clear sign that they were selling services that they knew they couldn't fulfill, which is a key term for any fraud lawsuit. Now, within the complaint, there are a couple of nuggets. First, Time Warner Cable leased older generation single-channel D1 and D2 cable modems that weren't capable of delivering the speeds that were promised under contract. 2, Time Warner Cable concealed the failure of those modems, which could only deliver 20 megabits per second at best, by informing the FCC that all units would be replaced by 2013, which obviously they weren't. This meant that the FCC testing program, which verifies services against their promised speeds, did not include these old modems and therefore did not catch TWC in their regulation. 3, Time Warner Cable leased older wireless routers for $10 a month, of course, to more than 250,000 customers who paid for 200 megabits per second or better, even though those routers were technically limited to less than 100 megabits per second. And finally, Time Warner Cables oversubscribed almost all of its circuits. So, Cheebert, on the surface, this seems pretty damning. This sounds like, okay, this is a company that obviously sold services it couldn't deliver. They knew they couldn't deliver it. And it wasn't just a vague, maybe we won't be able to handle the load, but it was, no, the hardware actually can't deliver the services that we've sold. What would be the defense? Let me ask you to play devil's advocate. I know you don't normally play this position. I'll let you go on your rant later on. But do devil's advocate and tell me, if you were general counsel for Charter Time Warner Cable, what could you pull out of your technical tool bag to say, no, this isn't fraud, this is all a big misunderstanding?
Now, if I was general counsel for Time Warner, I'd go and say, hey, you know, all this new regulations about sharing our poles is, you know, going to bog down our crews, and we haven't been able to roll out the improvements like we really wanted to. We know this isn't true, but that's probably going to be their best defense, that they're oversubscribed on improvements dealing with the new regulations that Tom Wheeler saddled them with. And these guys are definitely holding their breath, hoping that Ajit Pai goes and says, no, don't worry about this. You know, just take your time and do things, because he is pro-business rather than pro-consumer. At least that's the way he's coming off right now. Now, tiny rant. By the way, even people that bought modern modems for themselves and installed them still couldn't get the promised bandwidth.
Right.
So I'm sorry. This is where I'm having a tough time saying, you know, Time Warner is, you know, playing nice. And I will say, though, Time Warner in Honolulu is doing okay, but it's a much, much smaller market, and they've done a lot more of slicing up the collision domains so they can actually get those speeds that they're promising. But New York is a completely different market.
Right. We've got Keith 512 and I think it's Swamp Rat, who are both saying that their providers are actually giving them more than they bought. Keith is saying he pays for 200, gets about 215. We've got, I think it was Swamp Rat who was saying he's paying for 50 and is getting closer to 60. So there are some customers who are getting decent bandwidth. But, you know, the question is what happens on a whole? And that's really what the New York Attorney General is trying to do. And he's trying to say, look, in New York, in this specific area, they're definitely overselling a service. And as Cheebert, you brought up, this is why the complaint contains so many different levels of complaint against TWC Charter. Because, yes, it wasn't just the hardware that the customers, the end users had, but that was part of it. It wasn't just the interconnects, but that's part of it. It's not just the fact that they oversubscribed all their circuits, but it's part of it. And they're using that hole as a clear sign that Time Warner executives should have known that they could not live up to what they were selling. But still, this is a gray area because, you know, if you look at the advertising, it always says up to. It doesn't necessarily guarantee you, unless you're paying for a dedicated circuit, it doesn't guarantee you any sort of policy that's going to give you always 200 megabits per second. So how do we deal with this, Lou? I mean, when we have an ISP that is selling to end users, and we're not talking about the tiered internet here. We're not talking about going from provider to provider, but going out that last mile to the end user. What can the end user reasonably expect when he or she is buying these premium services?
I mean, they should expect consistency, right? I think, you know, what I was just envisioning the trial that would go on if they were, you know, around this lawsuit, if so, and, you know, they would produce evidence of a particular, you know, resident having that speed that they paid for at any point in time in a day or end of the week. And if they can produce that information, my thinking is this whole thing is kind of out the window for them. for the people and for the state, because like you said, it's up to that particular speed, and they don't necessarily they don't guarantee that it's going to be that speed all the time. But again, you have a certain level of expectation, a service level agreement, an SLA against these particular companies. Now in that case, it's almost an implicit SLA. It's not an explicit. So that means you're implicitly thinking that, hey, you should be up for a certain period of time, and I should at least get my speed for X amount of time, 9% of the time. But they don't guarantee any of that. And, unless you're buying a business tier version of their internet, right. They don't have these SLAs in place. So consumer internet, you might be getting 150, 100 megabit Comcast, but what you'll notice is, during the high traffic areas, when people get home, they turn on Netflix, they start streaming on the weekends, these types of things, you'll start to see these numbers go down considerably, and they don't have to guarantee those speeds. So I think, regardless if they had own modems or not, you're always going to have pipe problems unless they can guarantee them. And that's why I have business internet. I do pay a premium for the SLA and for the additional bandwidth to get consistent speeds. And if I don't get them, they come out and they have a SLA on when they come out and actually fix these things. So I think, it depends. Now these people are saying they paid extra. That means that they should have at least demanded some kind of consistency, some kind of SLA from the company. But again, they don't. They just want the speed, the raw speed.
Right. And okay, so let's take a couple of points here. I do want to play devil's advocate here, Cheebert, and I'm going to throw this back at you. Lou brought up the fact that you're always going to see drop-off at peak times. It doesn't matter what network you're on. It doesn't matter if you're in a residential circuit. It doesn't matter if you're in a business circuit. If you're on a shared circuit, when there's more people using that circuit, your share of that speed is going to drop. That's just networking. That's physics. What I could see Charter and Time Warner arguing is the New York Attorney General, they specifically, in their complaint, said at peak times, these speeds could be 70% lower than what they were advertised. And I could see Time Warner and Charter saying, well, yeah, of course, when there's more people on it, I mean, you knew you were buying into a shared circuit, you're going to have your speeds drop. And we've got people in the chat room who are making light of the situation, saying, look, at 3 a.m., you got way more than speed than we advertised, and it bounces out over the day. And it seems like that's an easy way to poke fun at them, but, I mean, isn't that true? Have we come to expect too much from what is essentially low-cost broadband?
I personally think, yeah. I understand that when people come home or on Sunday evenings when people are scrambling to do their homework, that my internet connectivity is not going to be terrific. In fact, I'm actually expecting Netflix to buffer. But I think what needs to happen, and unfortunately, I don't have a lot of faith that it is that the FCC really and truly needs to go and come up with some sort of definition, or an industry panel needs to come up with a definition on what is an acceptable level of oversubscription. I think that's going to be key to the case, is what is the acceptable level of oversubscription, which directly affects how is your performance going to be on loaded versus unloaded. And realistically, it should be when you have your neighborhood oversubscribed. I tell all our viewers, if your cable speed or your data speed really and truly is horrible, complain. Don't suffer in silence. Complain. In theory, at least it's worked in Hawaii, if enough people in the neighborhood complain, the Time Warner people in Honolulu will go and slice the collision domain smaller and section up the neighborhood. And I've seen massive jumps in our speed in my neighborhood. So we'll see. This is going to be really, really interesting. And I know for a fact that a whole bunch of other states are watching this case very carefully, because they're sharpening their knives saying, hey, Comcast has been horrible. Let's go after Comcast next. Ought to be interesting.
Right. I don't want to bog down in the story. I'm sure we're going to come back to it, because I think you're right, Cheebert. I think more and more states are going to pick up where the FCC left off. They're going to start looking at their advocacy, their constituents, and saying, look, how are our people being served by these corporations that now kind of have free reign in the broadband market? I will say this, though. We may be expecting too much for too little in this country, looking at how much it costs to deploy a network. However, one of the points of the New York Attorney General's lawsuit against Charter and Time Warner is if you know you can only deliver 100 megabits per second, you sell it as 100 megabits per second. It's no longer a technical thing. This is truth in advertising. If I'm only going to give you X amount, I can't claim that I'm going to give you 3X amount. And I think that's ultimately what the fraud part of the lawsuit is going to come down to. If you can't deliver, you can't promise to deliver, and that supersedes any technical glitch. We'll get back to the best of episode in just a bit, but first, let's take a moment to thank the sponsor of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. This episode is brought to you by GoToWebinar. It's the webinar platform that's hosted 2.7 million interactive web events with over 60 million views per year. Now, GoToWebinar believes that webinars are one of the best ways to interact with your prospects and customers. They know that PowerPoint presentations and emailed PDFs just don't have the punch. They don't have the power to bring people in. You need something that's interactive. You need something that's engaging. You need something that's vibrant. You need GoToWebinar. Now, with GoToWebinar, you can create custom email invitations, confirmations, and reminders, or you could just let GoToWebinar handle it all for you with automated email templates. You can display your company logo and custom image in all their webinar materials. You can create and schedule pre-recorded webinars that are as interactive as your live events. It's also mobile-friendly, which is important in this day and age. You can schedule a webinar, edit a session, or track performance from your iOS or Android device. You can create up to 20 polls before the session or on the fly for audience interaction. You can add up to 20 questions to a survey and engage participants with Q&A. Speaking of engaging your participants, you can engage your audience with more than one presenter and panelist. Up to 6 presenters can share their webcams and participate face-to-face. You can broadcast a view of your desktop or a specific application. In other words, you can show exactly what you need to show to make your point, to make the power of the presentation come to life. And with GoToWebinar's reporting and analytics, you're just a click away from qualified leads, from metrics and data to improve your webinars. You'll have end-to-end 128-bit AES encryption and a service that is rated #1 in customer satisfaction. So here's what we want you to do as you head into the new year. Turn your next presentation into a conversation with GoToWebinar. For more information, visit gotowebinar.com/podcast. That's gotowebinar.com/podcast. And we thank GoToWebinar for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Now let's get back to the best of 2017. We welcome back to the show a man who, well, I just love it anytime he can be in the studio because he is a font of knowledge about all things storage. Mr. Cameron Crandall. Cameron, thank you very much for coming back onto This Week in Enterprise Tech.
Thank you.
Now, you're here because this is here. This is the Kingston DCP 1000. Now, we got a sneak peek at this last year. We saw a bit more at CES, but now this is actually ready for the marketplace. If someone were to go up to you and say, well, what is a DCP 1000, what would you tell them?
In its basic form, it's a high-performance NVMe SSD. So NVMe is the new storage protocol for attaching SSDs to the PCI Express bus.
Right, right. And, of course, we've had storage options aplenty over the last couple of years, especially with the advent of M.2 devices that are really kind of stretching the boundaries of what you can get over a couple of lanes of PCIe revision 2 and revision 3. But the DCP 1000 is special because where on a high-performance part, a modern high-performance part, I might be able to manage, say, 2,500 megabytes per second, maybe 150,000 IOPS per second. The DCP does more. Tell me about the performance.
Yeah, so M.2 is good for kind of smaller implementations, desktop systems. Some of our server boards are using them for boot. The DCP 1000 is really designed for really a high performance data drive in a server. So really we see databases being run off of this. Very, very high performance workload. So this drive is actually capable of delivering 7,000 megabytes a second of throughput and over 1 million read IOPS off of a single card.
Okay. Again, let's back up, put that in perspective. So a typical high-performance drive that I might end up with in my consumer PC, if I was willing to pay for it, would be 2,500 megabits per second. This does 7,000. I'd be expecting 100 to 150,000 IOPS. This does over 1 million.
Yeah.
All right. So a little bit of a performance jump, which I got to ask, how did you do that? Because, I mean, when everyone else is topping out at about 200 to 2,500 megabytes per second and 100 to 150,000 IOPS, how do you increase that by an order of magnitude?
So we do it through aggregation. So today we've got the availability of PCI Express switching technology. So what we do, instead of laying down a big 32-channel controller on this card with a lot of NAND, we actually aggregate 4 physical controllers behind a switch and bring that to the PCI Express bus. And that's what enables us to get those giant performance numbers.
Okay. All right. I'm going to have to stop here because you say switch. I know there's going to be people in my audience who their ears kind of perk up and they say, okay, if you're adding something that's switching between controllers, I'm going to add a lot of latency, right? I mean, it's just going to kill it because now I don't have full-time access to all 4 of those controllers. I only have it when the switch is pointing to that controller. Does this kill latency?
It doesn't kill it. I mean, there's a small penalty, right? We're doing this in hardware, so the penalty is very, very small. You know, in the NVMe deployments today and into the future, NVMe and PCI Express switching is really a necessity to be able to scale PCI Express because of the lane limitation of PCIe and the processors.
Yeah, and Kevin, if you could go ahead and take a look at the system. We actually have a camera pointed at right now. This right here. So this is not what you would expect out of a PCIe board. When we've seen these in the past, it's typically just an interface between an M.2 slot and the PCIe. This is 4 M.2s, although that's not really that important, with what's doing the switching. So what piece of silicon is doing the switching between them?
So we have a PLX switch. It's an Avago switch that's used to do that switching. And again, the PCI Express switching technology is now mainstream and readily available. You see it a lot used on server backplanes for aggregating U.2 SSDs. We've brought that to the half height, half length card to aggregate controllers and NAND to get high performance to the single PCI Express slot. Basically, we're able to deliver flash array type performance to the PCI Express bus.
That's amazing. We have seen solutions that could do that in the past. Fusion IO is famous for having done something like this almost, more than a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago. But their solution was entirely proprietary and was ridiculously expensive. Obviously, the price goes way down when you start using off-the-shelf pieces. But what did Kingston have to do? Because I know there's some serious design work in here. What did Kingston have to do to be able to implement a switching technology between 4 M.2 products in order to get that kind of performance without getting the penalty that you would typically associate with switching?
So, so a couple of things. You know, like you said, everything's off the shelf now, right? NVMe is mature. The PCI Express switching technology is mature and it's readily available at a low price point. One of the advantages we have, we control the firmware on the SSD as well as on the PCI Express switch. And within that, we're able to do sophisticated things which enable the performance we're talking about.
Right. This is a Revision 3 product. So what in Revision 3, how much throughput do I have on every lane of PCIe?
So you've got the capability of 1,000 megabytes a second per lane.
And this will do PCIe 3, Revision 3 by 8.
By 8, yeah. And we're almost saturating that at nearly 7,000 megabytes a second.
And this is something that we've talked about last year when we had you in individual segments. How many lanes would I have on a typical, say, server motherboard?
So it depends on the processor. You could have anywhere from, it really depends on the processor, up to 40, 45 lanes.
Yeah, but what would the typical loadout be? And let's pull back. Let's say a system that might be used on a desktop. I'd get access to how many?
You're probably looking at 25 to 35 lanes.
Right. And so between the graphics card and whatever else I might want in there, you really start to run out quickly.
Correct.
And was that one of the driving factors behind using switching technology on a single card?
It was. You will run through PCI Express lanes pretty quickly once you start adding SSDs that want to utilize lots and lots of channels, right? So yeah, definitely, it was the switch is there for primarily for aggregation of those physical devices to a single PCI Express slot. So basically, you don't have to go out and make a new investment in a system that supports NVMe bays.
Right.
You can drop this card in immediately and take advantage of the performance of NVMe and the scalability that comes by way of the switch.
Yeah. I'm going to have to ask, is SATA dead? I mean, obviously, it's still fast enough for what we do today, but it would seem that most of the new technologies coming out today from Kingston and other storage manufacturers, they can provide so much more than what you can get over the SATA bus. Even if you were to rev the SATA bus again, it's not really keeping up.
Yeah, SATA will always be a low-cost play. I mean, not only in the client space, but even in the data center. But definitely as NVMe begins to come down in cost, and not that it's that far away from SATA in terms of cost, NVMe will begin to put a lot of pressure on SATA, especially if it's at the same price point.
Right.
Then there's really no reason to stay with SATA, and you should go to the next bump in performance.
Yeah, it's going to be like every interface that's ever come across. You go from RLL, MFM, IDE. Eventually, you're going to see systems that still support them because those devices will still be out there, but they'll just start disappearing because the performance just isn't there.
Yeah, they'll coexist for a while, and then again, when the price point of NVMe comes down in the form of M.2s on client systems and U.2 on the server, it's pretty much a no-brainer at that point. You would move to PCIe.
All right. Now let's talk a little bit about the setup on the desk, because right now we've got this wonderful little box that's running one of the DCP 1000s. There's also a U.2 device in there. You're running iometer. Can you actually show us?
Sure.
What's going on? So tell me what's going on here.
So we've got two of our devices in the system. So we've got the DCP 1000, which is shipping today, that we're talking about, and then also our DCU 1000, which is our U.2 SSD. It's a prototype that's running. So basically, what we're showing here is iometer, which is a very common workload generator for SSDs. And we're showing that these two physical devices are producing 1.8 million read IOPS off of two physical devices. And to get this type of performance with SATA SSDs, we'd have to use 3 RAID controllers, 24 drives. Now we're able to deliver this type of performance to the PCI Express socket.
Oh, because I remember Kingston a while back having one of those Uber systems set up with, I don't know how many drives were in it, but it was in a transparent case, and it was getting ridiculous throughput. But you're right, I had to basically fill the case with drives. You are allowing me to do that on a single board.
Yep.
Which is different. Okay. The other unit is in there, and we do need to talk about that, is that U.2 device. Tell me about the U.2 interface.
So U.2 is necessary from a serviceability standpoint, right? What I like to call the traditional storage model, which we're all familiar with, we're all comfortable with. We need to be able to hot plug SSDs in the data center, right? So if we want to go out and displace racks and racks of SATA and SAS-based hard drives and SSDs, we have to make PCI Express serviceable. So U.2 is necessary for that serviceability aspect and scalability. I would add that as well. But the serviceability is key. People are not going to abandon HA and serviceability practices. So we have to have U.2 in order to achieve that.
Right, and it just makes sense, because yes, it's nice having something that's really fast on a single card, but if I've got dozens upon hundreds of systems, you want something that's front of rack rather than having to pull the entire chassis out.
Correct.
Okay. Let's talk about something that we've seen over the last couple of years. There's been this weird reversal, because we got so accustomed to technology starting in the enterprise and then trickling down to the consumer. Over the last decade, that kind of reversed. You started seeing some high-performance technologies start in the consumer area and then move in the enterprise. The most noticeable was flash. where it really started in consumer, and then you started getting companies that were recognizing they would love higher IOPS and higher throughput inside of a box. But that kind of, well, it doesn't always work so well when you take a consumer drive and stuff it into an enterprise box. Why is that?
So several years ago, we were able to give a data center customer a high-performance client-based drive, and they loved it. It was so much faster than the hard drive that it was wonderful. Now what we're seeing is the data center customer is more competent. They understand the SSD technology more, and now they're peeling back the onion a little bit further. What's good for a desktop application not always is good for a server-based application. And primarily what those folks like to look at is performance consistency.
Right.
How consistent is the IOPS performance that's being delivered from the SSD? They weren't necessarily looking at that on the client drives as much as they are now. And latency. Does the drive go away for a long period of time, and does it respond slowly? So these customers have written their own testing applications for SSDs, and they put us to the test. They'll line up a Kingston drive and 2 or 3 of our competitors, and they'll look for weaknesses in the design, and they'll call us out on it if they see it. So latency and IOPS performance consistency are really the key in the data center, and the data center customer is much more sophisticated today than they've ever been.
Yeah, it's starting to become common to say that bandwidth numbers are great for bragging rights, but when you're actually talking about real-time workload, if you don't have low latency, if you don't have the IOPS, you could have as fast of a drive as possible, but you could do one thing very fast, not everything that you would need on a typical modern OS.
Right.
Okay. Oh, we've had Alan Malventano come on, and he's been developing a new way to test fast storage subsystems. And he's always been impressed with how well Kingston has done. And that's one of the things that he's really noticed about your drives, which is when you start hammering some of the high bandwidth parts, their latency goes way up and their IOPS go way down. Kingston's always sort of stayed the path. How is that different? I mean, this is still a little bit magic to some of our audience where they think, well, flash is flash. A controller is a controller. A part is a part. How is it that one device that looks identical to another device might be able to survive an enterprise workload versus a consumer workload, whereas another just dies, just fails?
Yeah, so a lot of that has to do with firmware design for the SSD, and like anything, you've got to give up something somewhere to get an improvement somewhere else, right? So if our goal is performance consistency, maybe we take a little bit of hit in the bandwidth performance. So maybe we're not doing 550 megabytes a second. Maybe we're doing 500 or 480 megabytes a second. But what we get from that is performance consistency.
Right.
So firmware is key. Being able to hold a large part of the drive's mapping table in a DRAM cache is a big part of that as well, as opposed to it being in flash. So there's a lot of considerations how your garbage collection, your background operations are done, when they're done, how they're done, all affects that performance consistency. And so now in today's SSD market, we really have SSDs that are really application specific, and it's great for the customer because they can buy a low cost SSD that's designed for client use, or maybe they want to do read only type of application work, and then you've got the complete other spectrum where you've got drives that are better for random write performance.
Right.
So there's a good variety of SSDs in the marketplace today to really address different types of workloads, but performance consistency and high IOPS performance for the data center is really the key for what most of our data center customers are looking for.
Looking at these products that we've got in front of us, so we've got the PCIe DCP-1000, and then we've got the U2 unit. What kind of capacities are we going to expect to see in those?
So both of these drives are offered in 800 gig, 1.6 terabyte, and 3.2 terabyte.
Right. Yeah. Our audience would notice if I didn't mention another technology that's very exciting right now, and that's Crosspoint, where we've finally seen an actual retail product from Intel for their new Crosspoint technology. And it's nice. It's very fast. We had Alan Malventano come on the other week, and he showed off the specs, and he said he was very impressed. It is a next-generation product, but one of the things about it was incredibly, fantastically expensive for not that much. I mean, you have 300 gigabytes, and I think it was a $1,600 drive.
Yeah.
But my question to you would be, is Crosspoint going to eliminate Flash? I mean, is that a natural progression, or do you see the two technologies coexisting?
I think I see them coexisting. Crosspoint definitely has a nice performance play. I really see it more in a tiering fashion. And again, if you look at SSDs, SSDs are really give you the ability to do more with less, right? So if you can put a performance tier in your storage solution, Crosspoint fits in there. But if you look at really the mass deployment of Flash in terms of U.2 and half-height, half-length cards, I think the real volume will still be in the form factors that we're all familiar with and accustomed to.
We can actually do a live a live trigger and alert. I'll show you the text message that comes in. So what we allow our users to do is not just visualize the data, but we actually take that data, we process it, and we can perform actions based off the data that comes streaming in real time. So what I've done is I've dragged my device over and I've selected a temperature data. And now what I can do is I can select an action to perform. Now I could, for example, if the temperature goes above 86 degrees, I could turn on the buzzer, I could turn on the heater, or I could restart my device. But what I could also do is I can send a notification, which is what I'll do right now. And it's very, very easy. I could send a text message. Whoops. Add my recipient. And we'll just say this as test. And if I save that trigger saved. Now, in order to make that trigger fire, we'll manipulate the data a bit. We need to make that temperature sensor rise. So I have a heater that is hooked up at the offices. So if I turn the heater on, what we're going to do is we're going to go look at this temperature widget, which the heater is pointed directly at. And you're going to see it rise fairly rapidly. So it's at 72, 73, 75. I forgot what I set the threshold at. But once it does actually reach that threshold, if you want to pan back and view I can show you the phone where the text message is going to actually appear.
Yeah,
here.
just hold it up and we'll switch back over. So you get a little warning.
Yeah, so let's wait for it to pop up.
We're getting a lot of glare from the screen. Oh yeah, like hold it off at an off angle.
Okay. And so the text message just came in. Let's see here.
Nice.
BMP reached the threshold temperature of 86 degrees. This is connected to demo board 2. So that literally is the best demo that I can explain of how easy it is to connect a sensor and start doing actions and making triggers off of whatever you connect.
Now, Christopher, this is an interesting thing because the whole point of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is to put broadband providers back at the service of the communities in which they exist, which by the way, was the actual language from the 1986 Cable Act. That's why they were given right-of-way. That's why they were given preferential treatment in deploying their networks, because they promised that they would always be for the good of the community. Of course, you've got the active shooter program that you're still working on. What are the other issues that you tie to that betterment of the community?
Sure. One of the things that we really wanted to do with the video was to talk about how having a network built the right way gives you many options for service providers, for businesses, for at your home. But we kind of thought we wanted to start by grabbing people and making a key point about public safety, which is that, and we didn't quite get to it in the video. It's a long video. It's 20 minutes. But the way the network is designed, it uses software-defined networking, which I'm guessing more people on your show understand than most of the talk shows that I talk on. But the idea is that the network's very dynamic, and you can do very interesting things to re-provision the network on the fly to allow different applications to do very interesting things, basically. We can get into that more if you want later. But one of the things it does is it puts not just ISPs back in the driver's seat, but potentially people in their homes and businesses, and that anyone in Ammon can create their own application. They can offer it to neighbors. There's a portal that actually is very sophisticated that allows service providers to do very interesting things. I mean, the most basic of which would be to create a kind of a LAN party locally across town, if you wanted to securely play games or transfer medical information or whatever you want to do. It's a whole nother paradigm. And the idea is, much like the internet, AT&T is not going to give this to you, but a network that is not focused on extracting wealth will give it to you. And I think some private companies might do that, small private companies. I think some local governments could help to enable it to happen, but we have to get away from the big companies if we're going to do that.
I love how the Institute has evolved over the last year and a half since you've been on. When you came on, you talked specifically about the challenges of getting municipal broadband networks built out. And I mean, yeah, TWiET is replete with examples of us talking about that story. There's all sorts of local and state laws that make that very, very difficult. And your Institute was going in and actually advising these groups. If you wanted to build out, this is what you need to do. These are the things you have to make sure you have in play. These are the people you have to contact. How have you grown past that? Because now it sounds that now that you're actually talking about the application of the network, deploying different solutions across existing networks, you've not only said, yes, you can build your own networks, but also there are all these wonderful things that you can do with the network that have wonderful effects for the community.
Well, I can't take credit so much for the wonderful things that are happening. In many ways, we're trying to report on things that are happening. I mean, we offered a little bit of advice to the city of Ammon, and I'm sure that it helped. But they were doing really great things, and our role has been to get more attention on that, because if people don't learn about it, then it may not be duplicated. And fundamentally, we want it to be duplicated. I think, to some extent, we're really, for many years, under fire as municipal network proponents. And in recent years, we have not had to dedicate all of our time to defending municipal networks, because so many people, including people on the right and the left and in the middle, I mean, basically everyone agrees, communities should be able to do this if they want to. So we don't have to spend all of our time arguing that cities should be able to make this choice for themselves. We're able to go to the next step, I think.
That is interesting that you've come under fire and you found allies across the spectrum. I think there is that little bit of mindset change, even since the last time that you were on, when people still didn't accept the fact that internet access is, well, it's a prerequisite now. It's not a luxury. It's not something that you just get if you have extra time. If you're looking at contemporary economic development or social development and you're not connected, it makes it incredibly problematic. Do you think enough of us have made that switch over where we realize that a broadband connection is just about as important as having electricity?
Yes. One way to say it, and I think is dangerous to say it's as important as electricity. Although I will say that I was talking with a community network in Washington, in rural Washington state, where they had a major fire come through, and the utility, which does fiber as well as electricity, would talk to people, and they would say, when are you going to get our service back? And they would say, we're going to have your electricity back in a week or 10 days or whatever it's going to be. And people would say, yeah, electricity. When is my internet going to come back? Because they view that as being more important. But the way I like to say it is, a person can get by without electricity, without internet service, but a community needs internet service just as much as it needs electricity to thrive if it wants to have modern businesses and quality of life. So I do think most of us get that. I don't think congressional leadership gets that. I don't think the Trump team gets that. I think that Chairman Pai of the FCC gets that. But I think that you were 100% correct at the beginning of the show in saying they believe, or they act as though the market is working, and they want to believe the market is working, and therefore there is no role for a government at any level to try to correct any market failures. And I think that's something that we really have to work on, because whether you're dealing with the state or the federal government, if elected leaders are in the pocket of AT&T and Comcast, they can stop a lot of good progress from happening.
Okay. I got to back up. I 100% agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. But I can already hear the voices in my head, and these are different voices. These are just the voices from the chat room who would be screaming at me saying, wait a minute, no, that's not true. The reason why it's not working is because we've put regulations on it. And that's what they're trying to fix. They're trying to pull back the regulations. And once all those regulations are gone, there will be actual competition. I don't believe that. I think that the regulations were trying to fix an incredibly lopsided situation. But what would you say to someone, a congressman? Let's say you've given the ability to address a joint session of Congress. How would you convince them that the way it was working, the market wasn't working?
Well, let me say that if I had that opportunity, I'm not so sure that an argument would do it. Unfortunately, I do think that there's an element of power differential in that arguments don't carry the day in Congress. Powerful interests, special interests do, whether they have money or the ability to garner votes. But nonetheless, if I had that opportunity to make that argument, what I would say is that we have a natural experiment running, 50 states, various regulatory environments. For the most part, when you hear this idea that it is regulations that are getting in the way, they're talking about local regulations dealing with rights of way. And those vary dramatically from state to state and from community to community, with about half the states actually having removed local authority to even require things like video franchising for cable services. We have not seen a difference in investment in different states or different localities based on different regulatory approaches, which to me suggests that there's actually a common problem, and I've identified that as Comcast, AT&T, a few corporations that have a lot of market power. And I think that Google's pulling back on fiber really demonstrates this. You know, there's been a lot of talk in the press, and some of us have occasional off-the-record talks with people either that are working in Google or with Google, and you really get the sense that Google's main problem was getting on polls. If you want to talk about the problem with getting on polls, it actually has not been state or federal or local government regulation. It's the entities that either own the polls or already are already attached to the polls. And honestly, it's really AT&T in a lot of ways. Google really went after AT&T markets. I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but AT&T was able to play a lot of games to make it very difficult to get on polls. And actually, we have a discussion for people who really want to get in the weeds on poll attachment, which I promise you is actually fantastically interesting. People spend their entire lives working on poll issues. I have an interview that we're going to be doing on Tuesday, and I'll happily send it to you. Maybe you can report on it next week. That talks about how Google wanted to get on 120,000 polls. Even if AT&T wasn't being obstructionist, it would have been a difficult process. The fact that AT&T was being obstructionist means that they basically could not do it. And I don't know that there's a set of federal regulations, frankly, that would even solve that. But we have some that I think would help. That would be more pro-regulatory than anti-regulatory. But let me just say finally that we are running an experiment. Republicans that claim that regulations are in the way have all the votes that they need at the FCC and in Congress to remove regulations. We'll see over the next several years if there's an explosion of investment. I'm afraid that there will not be. To the extent that there is, it will not come from the biggest providers.
We have to do a little bit of fan service to our chat room. We've got a super fan of the show and a super fan of you, JJ to the 4884 in our chat room, who is in Augusta. He has taken every possible chance to push Augusta as a new hub of technology. Can you explain some of the interesting things happening in Augusta? Because I know that you're the former president of the Greater Augusta ISSA, and of course B-Sides in Augusta. What's happening over there? Because I'm hearing more and more about interesting things in security.
Absolutely. So I definitely want to say thank you to JJ for being such a proponent and a cheerleader for Augusta. And I really appreciate him reaching out to you and helping us to get on the show. So Augusta is really doing some amazing stuff in the world of cybersecurity, and we've been doing it for a long, long time. So, you know, we have a lot of things going on here from our military presence. We have U.S. Army Cyber Command is in the middle of moving to Fort Gordon right here in Augusta, Georgia. And so in terms of cyber personnel, you're talking about 5,000 cyber jobs moving to Augusta, Georgia over the next 5 years. That's a huge community in and of itself. And that's just U.S. Army Cyber Command. Besides that, we have NSA Georgia, a very large NSA installation. We have private organizations that are building some amazing security teams. We have communities that are kind of springing up that try to pull all of these individuals together. So Mark Baggett was the founding president of the Greater Augusta ISSA way back in 2006. And that thing has just kind of snowballed where we have meetings quarterly. We have usually about 100 attendees. We have, you mentioned B-Sides Augusta. We started doing that a few years ago. That thing has just snowballed. Last year, we had over 700 attendees at that. That's a day-long conference. We bring in folks from all over the country, really top-named speakers. So we've got so many things going on in Augusta. It's really pretty amazing. The funny thing is, growing up here, I always thought I would have to leave Augusta because it was such a small town. And if I wanted a serious security job or a serious computer job, I need to move to a quote unquote real city like Atlanta or DC or something like that. But we're really kind of building a community that is going to have some great companies, going to have some great job opportunities, and really kind of show the world what Augusta itself has to offer.
All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the suite, because it's an interesting collection. I mean, I could see using Snort. I love using things like Ethereal and Wireshark to take a look at the network just for giggles. But you've crafted a tool that integrates some of the most popular tools out there to do intrusion detection, to do network security monitoring, and to do log management. Tell me what goes inside of the security onion.
Absolutely. So you brought up two really big names, Snort and Wireshark. Everybody who's done anything in IT networking has used Wireshark at some point in time. And that's an amazing tool. But, the thing about Wireshark is that if you are on an enterprise network and you've got a gigabit of traffic, you've got 10 gigabits of traffic, there's no way that you can pull that up in Wireshark and go through there line by line, packet by packet, and find those bad guys. So what we do is we take the best of breed open source tools for how do you really find that needle in the needle stack. The old phrase is needle in the haystack, but really, we're dealing with so much traffic. We're talking about a needle in the needle stack. So, how do you figure out, based on all of your millions and billions of HTTP transactions that you may have on your network, which one of those actually delivered an exploit kit to one of your workstations? You're talking about looking at all the millions of SMTP connections on your network and figuring out which one of those actually delivered a spear phishing email. So, using those tools that are going to make you most efficient as a defender to try to catch as many bad guys as possible and catch them as quickly as possible.
We did have a question in the chat room from Emily the Strange. She wanted to know if this was a suite or a distro, and it can be installed as a distro, but you're going to get people who, and this is before we get into the demo, you're going to get people who are like, wait a minute, I have my favorite flavor distro X or Y or Z, and I don't want to change from that just to use your suite. Can I take all the tools that you put into the security onion and drop it on top of my favorite distro?
So all of our tools are free and open source. They can be compiled on just about any Linux distribution. So if you want to invest the time and effort in manually compiling and configuring this software, you can certainly do that, and lots of people have. Beyond just Linux, folks use FreeBSD as well. So if you're, a hardcore FreeBSD user, you can certainly compile and configure all this software on just about any Unix-like platform you want to. But what I would say there is that, I've seen so many folks who spend all of this time compiling and configuring the software that they end up spending more time being a sysadmin rather than actually catching bad guys. And I think that's part of that equation that I mentioned earlier that is currently kind of balanced in favor of the bad guys, because if we're kind of distracted by having to compile and configure all the software and get it working, and, it's like when you walk up to a roller coaster, you must be this tall to ride this ride. It takes a certain Unix sysadmin wizardry to try to get this stuff up and running. But, my goal here with Security Onion is that, to try to rebalance that equation, let's make this as easy as possible to use. Let's make this easy enough so that any old Windows admin off the street, even if they don't have a whole lot of Linux experience, can simply click next, next, finish, and get this amazing suite of network security monitoring technologies up and running very, very quickly.
Precisely. And that's actually my take. When it comes to security, you know what? My personal preference isn't as important as making sure that the tools I'm using are actually working properly. And that's the whole idea of the Security Onion distro. You install it, everything's up. Okay, time to show. I mean, we all love the idea of people talking about security. We all love the idea of there being tools out there that can help us do our jobs. But show me how this actually works. What would be a typical way that a security professional, an IT professional, would use Security Onion?
Okay, so we ready for a demo?
Let's do it.
All right, so what you see on my screen, this is a web interface that we have called Squirt, which is going to show us IDS alerts, right? So everybody's familiar with the concept of an intrusion detection system. It's basically going to give us an alarm that says, hey, here's some interesting traffic. You need to take a look at this. So we've got some IDS alerts here. And by the way, I replayed this PCAP file, which was created by a great guy named Jack Crook, and it's based on the RSA data breach from a few years ago. So this is very heavily modeled after what real-world attackers actually do. And so one of the things that we see here in the IDS alert is a suspicious .doc.exe. So this is an attacker who is sending a spear phishing email and trying to convince a user to click on a hyperlink to download a quote-unquote harmless Word document, when in reality, it's actually an executable file. So when we drill into this, and I want to kind of use this as to compare and contrast with kind of the traditional IDS that most folks are used to, and most enterprise networks have some form of a commercial IDS on them that may generate an IDS alert like this. So when I, as an analyst, when me as a hunter, and I'm looking at this, I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, if this is telling me that one of my users downloaded a suspicious looking Windows exe, my first question might be, well, did they actually download the file? Did the download actually complete? And so what we see here is that IDS alerts can show us, in this case, this IDS alert is showing us that the user requested the file. So we see the HTTP GET request for this file. But the thing that we have to keep in mind about IDS alerts is that IDS alerts are really just the tip of the iceberg. We need to take that tip of the iceberg and we need to look beneath the surface of the water, because this IDS alert doesn't even tell me if the web server even had that particular exe. The web server could have said 404 not found, please go away. But that's why in Security Onion, we provide full packet capture, right? So that's going to be the videotape that we can rewind to really determine exactly what happened before and after that IDS alert. So this is what really makes the difference for incident response. So let's pivot from here to our full packet capture, right? So we've just pivoted from Squirt over to a separate web interface called CapMe, which goes and gets that full packet capture. So now I can see not only the GET request, but I can see the web server's actual response. So the web server says, yep, I've got that file. Here it comes. So here's your Windows exe header. We can scroll down and start looking through here, and we can see some clear text indicators in this exe. Again, because we have full packet capture, we've got this great videotape that we can rewind to see all of these artifacts. So here we see evidence that this is proxy-aware malware. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. I can scroll down a little bit further, and I start to see other interesting things like, oh, there's a hard-coded IP address. I see things like this right here. Right, so we've got the Windows registry key for run. That's a persistence mechanism that's built into this particular executable. Now, the other thing that I see is this strange looking thing right here. This is actually the default mutex for the Poison Ivy remote access Trojan. So Poison Ivy's been around for a long, long time, but attackers still use it today. Why? Because it still works. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So now instantly, having gone from an IDS alert, which didn't tell me much information, but going to full packet capture, I immediately get many different artifacts, which immediately kind of increase the severity of this particular incident. Because if there's an attacker who's compromised one of my workstations with poison ivy, well, then we need to take that very seriously, and we need to swing into incident response. So at this point, as an incident responder, I'm thinking, well, I need to figure out, okay, if the user downloaded this EXE, did they actually execute it? And so if I see an EXE with a hard-coded IP address, I'm going to say, well, if they executed it, it's probably going to be beaconing out to that command and control server at that IP address. So that's why with Security Onion, we not only give you the IDS alerts that we started with here, the full packet capture that we looked at here, but we also give you transactional data. We give you bro logs. We give you all of this context so that you can really, at a quick glance, figure out, okay, that compromised victim machine, what all did it do? Who all did it talk to? Right? So I can sort of pivot back to here. I can pivot over to ELSA. And that's going to give me this nice listing of all of these different data types, all of this different context that's going to really kind of paint a very vivid picture about what this machine has actually done. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, this BroCon, these are my bro connection logs. So let me drill into that, and let me take a look and see if there's any connections to that IP address that was hard-coded in that Windows executable. And sure enough, there's a connection. We see that IP address right here. So we can actually pivot to our full packet capture again, take a look at that entire TCP stream, and we can see here's this poison ivy command and control channel. It's encrypted, so we can't actually see what's going on. But as we scroll through, we start to get the feeling that there's this sort of back and forth. Right. There's this interactive shell session where the attacker is actually sending remote commands to this victim machine. He's probably pillaging the village. He's probably doing his lateral movement and probably preparing to do his exfiltration. So this gives us the sense that, okay, now this incident has gone to the next level. This attacker can do exactly what he wants to on this particular machine. Now we need to figure out if there's anything else going on here. So if we go back to our data types, we see that there's some FTP traffic. Well, now that's kind of interesting because quite often attackers like to use FTP for their data exfiltration. So we can actually pivot to our full packet capture here. And we try to tell people not to use FTP because it's clear text. But the good news for defenders, incident responders like me, being clear text, you can actually see what's going on. So here we see the attacker who is now telling this victim machine to log into his remote FTP server with a username of Jack, a password of 2awesome. And we can see where the attacker is telling that victim machine to upload two files, a file called 1.txt and a file called 2.txt. Right, so now we start to get a hint that, yes, there is actually data exfiltration. So now our job is to try to figure out what data was actually exfiltrated. So to do that, we're going to pivot back over to our connections. We're going to look for our FTP data. So here's one of those files. So we can pivot to our full packet capture. Again, having that full packet capture allows us to rewind the videotape. In this case, really see what the bad guy actually stole from our environment.
Doug, let me ask real quick, just for our audience, what kind of hardware am I going to need to make sure that I can do full packet capture?
So obviously, full packet capture, recording every single packet that you see is going to require some disk space. But the good news is disk is cheap, and it provides such an amazing benefit when it comes to incident response scenarios like this. I'm willing to throw a whole bunch of disk at this problem to ensure that I can actually piece together the scene of the crime so that I'm just not flying blind and trying to guess at what the adversary may have done.
Right. Okay. Just checking.
Yeah, great question. So here we see the attacker exfiltrating a file. We see that this is relating to gsec dump, which is a utility used to dump Windows password hashes. So this is quite often seen in attacker playbooks where they will dump your Windows password hashes. They'll exfiltrate them to their own environments so they can run a password cracker like John the Ripper, get your real passwords. And now what they can do is log back in to your VPN as you. They're no longer having to compromise machines. They're using legitimate accounts. So now we get a sense the attacker's actually exfiltrating something related to gsec dump and Windows password hashes. The next thing we want to take a look at is the other file that was transferred over FTP. So we'll take a look at this file. We'll pivot to our full packet capture. And here we see this is a RAR file. Now, attackers, they love their RAR files to exfiltrate their juicy bits of data that they've collected from your network. So now let's see if we can figure out what was actually in that RAR file. So I'm going to download this PCAP. You mentioned Wireshark before, so we'll open up this PCAP in Wireshark. And one of the things I said before is that Wireshark's a great tool, but if you're talking about gigabytes and gigabytes of traffic, going packet by packet is not really going to be optimal. But in this case, we can use Wireshark to carve this file right out of this PCAP. So we're going to save this as out.rar. So we've extracted that file. This is the file that the attacker actually exfiltrated from our environment. If I open that, it is a password-protected RAR file, right? Attackers love RAR files. They especially love password-protected RAR files. Now, if I had more time, I would actually kind of turn the tables on the attacker because earlier I said that attackers take your password hashes and then they crack them using John the Ripper. What I would do is I would actually use John the Ripper to crack this RAR file. We don't have the time to do that, so I'll just go ahead and type in the password here. But the good news is, once we figure out that password, now we can actually see what that attacker has actually stolen from our environment. So this may be your credit card numbers. This may be your social security numbers. This could be your intellectual property. This could be United States government top secret data. Whatever the case may be, because we collect all of this data, because we record all of this data, we can perfectly reconstruct the scene of the crime. We can have 100% confidence that we know the attacker got in this way via spear phishing email. They then compromised a machine. They did some lateral movement. They pillaged the village. They got the data they were going after, and they exfiltrated it from the environment. And we can know that with 100% confidence based on these tools that we provide in Security Onion.
Folks, you've done it again. You've used up another hour or two. I don't know how long this is going to be edited of your time with the best enterprise podcast in the universe. I want to thank everyone who makes this show possible. Of course, that means my co-host. That's Chee, that's Lou. That's all the guests that we've had on this year. And of course, it has to include you. Folks, I can't tell you how much I appreciate all the support that we've had from you all these years. Without you, we don't have a show. Without an audience, we don't have a reason to come together every week to discuss some of the things that are near and dear to us, so precious. We love to see how the world is connected. We love to see how this technology works, and you are the ones who enable us to do that. So to you, thank you. Thank you so very, very much, especially since this will be my last Christmas special with TWiET, at least for a while, with me moving away. It's a special place in my heart, and it's a memory that I will hold with me forever. Now, if you could, please, why don't you invite some of your friends, some of your coworkers to visit our show page at TWiET.tv. There you'll be able to find all of our episodes, all of our previous videos, all of our show notes, so you can find out who we've been talking to, what news stories we've been covering, the links to the various companies that we've had here on the show. It's a really good way to use TWiET as a resource for your work or for your study. And as long as you're there, why not subscribe to us? Why not make this your New Year's resolution to make sure you consume more TWiET? You can get an audio version, a video version, or a high-definition video version, again, just by going to twit.tv/TWiET. Also, while you're there, why not jump onto my Twitter page at twitter.com/PadreSJ. There you will find what I'm going to be doing for every episode of every show that I do here on the TWiT TV network, and you'll also be able to chat with me. Why not tell me how you're doing? Why not show me the projects that you're working on? Nothing makes me happier than to see what the TWiT Army comes up with, especially if the ideas come from the TWiET Riot. Finally, thanks to everyone here who makes this show possible. Again, to Lisa and Leo for letting me do this show for so many years. To our incredible engineering staff, Jammer B and Burke and Alex. And yes, to my TD. Kevin has been with me this entire year. Kevin, you're a fantastic person. Now, this is the time of the show where we get to give you some redemption for all the things you've gotten wrong in the past. So we're going to pull a little knowledge from the show, and hopefully you get it right. And the question this week will be, looking at the show, looking at all the knowledge that you've gained, what is the name of this show?
This week in Enterprise Tech.
You know what? You got to get one right a year. Thank you. Very well done, Shark Boy.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Finally.
And again, folks, I thank you. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas. No matter what you're celebrating, may this be a season of joy and a season of happiness for you. I'll see you in the new year with the full crew. Until then, I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the Digital Jesuit, just reminding you that if you want to know what's going on in the Enterprise, just keep TWiET.